From the banks of Dewey Lake, it's the Dewey Pod Monster.
All right, welcome back. My name is John, and this is the Dewey Pod Monster Podcast. This is a weekly podcast, and it is about consumption. We are, of course, proud members of the You Run Podcast Network. You can find all of our past episodes and all of our future episodes, as well as all the other great shows on the You Run Podcast Network at yourunpodcast.com. With me this week is, of course, the host of the Dewey Pod Monster Podcast, and his name is Sean. Sean, how are you doing today?
John, come with me if you want to live. That was like the easiest low-hanging fruit I could come up with.
I'm just going to leave then. I'm not... That's how I'm... Anyway.
All right. Well, nice knowing you. So anyways, this week we have...
As Sean was going to say, this week we have a guest with us. He is a member of the You Run Podcast Network as well, and his name is Justin. Justin hosts a show called Pop Culture Reflections Podcast. And Justin, how are you doing this evening?
I am great, and I am happy to be here. Thank you.
You're very welcome. We're glad to have you. This is another one that feels very overdue at this point. Mm-hmm. Before we get going on our topic for this episode, Justin, take a second and let people know what Pop Culture Reflections Podcast is, where they can find you, all that good stuff, and kind of break the ice a little bit.
Yeah, so, Pop Culture Reflections, I reflect back on all the things I'm nostalgic about in pop culture, and it's a wide variety of topics ranging from movies, music, television, pro wrestling, and a lot of other things. And over the last 6, 7, 8 months or so, I've brought a lot of guests on to talk about those type of topics with me. So yeah, if it's 80s, 90s or beyond and it's pop culture, I'm probably going to cover it at some point in time. So that's what the whole thing is. You can find the show on all the major, podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple, Amazon, iHeartRadio, all those other ones. So yeah, you can find us there. And of course, as you said, proud member as well of the You Run Podcast Network at yourunpodcast.com.
Awesome. So, and that's what we like. We like supporting the network. And one of the best ways to do that is talk about a movie that, I'm going to be honest, I'm going to get the spoiler warning out of the way now, because if you haven't seen this movie, I don't know what the hell you're doing here. Like, this is kind of like when we talked about Ghostbusters or a handful of other movies. If you haven't seen this movie, I'd really be curious to know how you found your way to this show in particular. So if that's the case, please leave a comment somewhere and tell us. But this week, we're talking about the movie Terminator 2, Judgment Day. I didn't even bother pulling a third-party review for this because, frankly, I went through 7 pages and they were just all 5 stars saying, just totally sucking this movie's dick. And I understand that, and we'll get to that, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. But as we usually do, I'm going to start with Sean. And Sean, why don't you let us know what Terminator 2 is about?
Okay, so I haven't seen this before. I'm kidding. So I went over to IMDB.com. I typed in Terminator 2. This movie called Terminator 2 came up. It's actually called After Dark. No, kidding. That's a different Terminator 2. This is Terminator 2 Judgment Day.
I've already threatened 2 people with that movie at some point in the future. Just not today. So
cool. I'm down. Anyways, this gets 8.6 out of 10 with 1.2 million ratings. It is down in popularity to 482. Down 14 numbers from some number. And I think this is the first movie in a while that we've talked about that actually has a rating. So that's always a benefit. And we go to the storyline of the plot, never sure which one's which, but we go to the one on top because they wouldn't put it on top if you weren't supposed to read it first. It says, a cyborg identical to the one who failed to kill Sarah Connor must now protect her 10-year-old son, John, from an even more advanced and powerful cyborg. Every time I see Sarah Connor, I want to say it like, Sarah Connor. And then we scroll on down.
It's the only way to say it.
Yeah, really. That's how I read it in my mind. We go to the storyline. So I guess the other one was the plot. This one comes care of Eric GGG. Thank you, Eric. It says, over 10 years have passed since the first machine called the Terminator tried to kill Sarah Connor and her unborn son, John. The man who will become the future leader of the human resistance against the machines is now a healthy young boy. However, another Terminator called the T-1000 is sent back through time by the supercomputer Skynet. This new Terminator is more advanced and more powerful than its predecessor, and its mission is to kill John Connor when he's still a child. However, Sarah and John do not have to face the threat of the T-1000 alone. Another Terminator, identical to the same model that tried and failed to kill Sarah Connor in 1984, is also sent back through time to protect them. Now, the battle for tomorrow has begun.
So with all that in mind, we're going to take a slight change of pace from what we usually do before we get into cast and crew and all that type of stuff. Justin, welcome to the show. I'd like to ask, do you remember your first experience with this mega franchise blockbuster, specifically this chapter of the Terminator franchise?
Yeah, I mean, this one even more than the first, even though I saw the first very young as well. But I remember vividly my mom, taking me to the video store in late 91, early 92, whatever it was. And I immediately, when I saw this, had to rent this because I was already like into the Terminator at that point, and I remember seeing like the TV ads and the action figures and shit like that. So I was already like into it without even seeing the film. So it was immediate, and I remember like it was yesterday. Took it home, watched it that night probably 3 times. Like I watched it and then put it back on again, and then I rewind it and put it back on again. So it was like, yeah, it was one, and it was like the perfect time for me because I was, 10, 11. So it was just like, when you're a boy of 10 or 11, this stuff appeals to you. And so it was right up my wheelhouse at that time. So I remember it as vivid as anything from that era.
And Sean, it's been well documented that you are a resident Terminator fan. Do you have a memory for, well, more so. I think we both are, but more, you're the expert, more or less.
Oh,
so
wow.
Do you have a memory of your first experience with this one?
I mean, I think it was more of like the hype surrounding it coming out because I was 14 when it came out. I remember having the t-shirt, like it was high school for me. It was a freshman year of high school, new school, moved into the area, like hadn't lived nearby, had the t-shirt, wore the t-shirt probably out, like wore it out as in it disintegrated eventually. But I remember that was like the t-shirt that I wore a lot. And a lot of kids were probably like, oh, that's that Terminator 2 kid. But yeah, so just that. And again, a lot of the things that I talk about, like it comes back to my relationship with my sister and going to see these kinds of movies because these were the kind of movies that we bonded over. And yeah, just going to see it in the theater and being blown away, all the hype. She got Premiere Magazine at the time, so it was, of course, like really heavily covered. And I mean, it was unavoidable. It was in the theaters it was like in the top 5 for 10 weeks or something like that, in the top 10 for 12 weeks. It was in the theater for 26 weeks.
They made children's toys for this movie, for Christ's sakes.
Well, yeah, we heard all about it. So, yeah, I mean, it was unavoidable for me.
Yeah, for me, I know I didn't see this in a theater, at least on its initial release. I think I've seen it like once in a theater on one of those like anniversary releases or something. But I vividly remember renting this movie as a kid. We had a dual head VCR, and this is one of the first movies I remember my father actively demanding that I bootleg and make a copy of to keep at home. And we actually ended up having to rent it 3 times because I became so obsessed with this movie that I wore my copied, VHS rental that I copied. I wore it out not twice. I wore it out 3 times. So we went through 3 different like blank tapes where we just had to keep re-recording it and do it again. So I don't even know how much we spent on renting it. Probably like $10 or something like that. But yeah, this was a movie that it's probably, at least at that point, the movie that I had rewatched and watched more than anything else that was available to me at the time. It does a lot right, and especially at like a young age where all you want is like, you could basically jumpstart puberty with this movie if you had to. And that might be a big part of why I liked it. But I mean, it does so many things that even as a kid, I could kind of realize like, no, this is a really cool fucking movie.
This is where John found his murder boner, because there's no nudity in the movie, is there? I mean,
there's not.
No, it's not. It's pretty tame
Arnold
in that
and
way.
Robert Patrick.
I feel like there's a scene where there's I think you see Sarah Connor with her shirt off. I don't think you see boobs or anything like that. I think it's just like a back shot or something, not to use that phrase. Back shots in mind. Sean, who directed this movie? Who's in this movie? What are we dealing with here? And I know you're going to start with the most obvious answer, which is Danny Cooksey from Salute Your Shorts, correct?
Well, I mean, I was going to start with James Cameron, but yeah, after that, okay. I would say whoever you said.
Cooksey?
Danny Cooksey, whatever. Yeah. I remember him from Different Strokes, so that's my first exposure to Danny Cooksey. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't even need to be said, but Arnold Schwarzenegger, Linda Hamilton, I won't even name the characters because I feel like if you don't know who the actors are that play these characters, or who the characters are that they play, maybe you should look it up. But we have Arnold Schwarzenegger as the T-101. We've got Linda Hamilton as Sarah Connor, Edward Furlong as her son, first role for Edward Furlong. We got Robert Patrick as the T-1000. And then we start getting into more of the supporting cast. We've got like returning James Cameron favorite Jeanette Goldstein. We've got Earl Bowen as Dr. Silberman, who appeared in the first movie as the psychiatrist at the police office. We've got Joe Morton as Miles Dyson, who we'll probably get into. He plays a big part in the whole Skynet thing. And then, yeah, we've got, of course, Leslie Hamilton Gearin as twin Sarah. Now, I mean, and we could go down the line as to all the other bit players, and a lot of these names no one will probably remember after those. Probably those top four: Arnold, Edward Furlong, Linda Hamilton, and Robert Patrick are probably the quad. I was going to say triumvirate, but that's three. The main four of this movie.
Hi, everyone. AI John here. Did you know that we're on the You Run Podcast Network? YouRunPodcast.com is home to great shows like You Gonna Eat That Crust, Pop Culture Reflections Podcast, Voices of the Mausoleum, and many more. Head over to YouRunPodcast.com and find your new favorite show today. Yeah, and I think it's telling on this because you kind of hit on it. These actors are almost synonymous with these roles. Like, Arnold might be the exception because Arnold went on and still did a lot of huge movies well after this. But with the exception of him, what has Linda Hamilton done that's been bigger than this? What has Robert Patrick done that's been bigger than this? And aside from The Crow 3 or whatever, what has Edward Furlong done that's been bigger than this?
Pecker.
Right. In fairness, didn't Edward Furlong get nominated for an Oscar for American History X, I believe? Or I think the movie got nominated for something like that. I mean, that movie was acclaimed, but yeah. I don't think he's ever been associated or more well-known with something other than this movie.
For good, at least.
Well, sure. So I don't really want to break this down beat by beat on the story, because I think as we talk about this movie, it's going to bring a lot of that out. Justin, let's start with you. Do you have any characters or actors that you really want to kind of highlight and start with, or kind of start breaking this movie down?
Yeah, so for me, I've always been impressed with the fact that in some ways, Cameron seems to bring out the best in Schwarzenegger, whether it's the first film or this film or even like True Lies. I think when he's under his direction, I think we get just about the best, version of Arnie, in my opinion, at least. So that's the one thing for me that's always been the big takeaway is I really like his performance in this film. Not that he has to do a whole lot or has to have a lot of range, but for what the character is, I think he does a great job. You had mentioned Goldstein and even like Xander Berkeley, I think is the name that plays the husband of the foster parents. I think they're both awesome. Again, small roles, but in their time on the screen, I think they do a great job as well. And you had mentioned Joe Morton. I've always liked him, whether it's a show like A Different World I remember him from, and even his role in Speed. I've always enjoyed him as a character actor. So those are probably Robert Patrick. I mean, I have my own takes on him. I like the character of the T-1000, but I've never been overly impressed with what he does with it. And I just don't think he's intimidating enough or believable enough to go against Arnold. But that's just me and a nitpick that I've always had with that. But other than that, I mean, for the most part, I think the entire cast does a pretty commendable job in this film.
It's interesting you say that about the T-1000, because I think in a lot of ways, what Robert Patrick does with that character in this movie specifically has become the thing that every single Terminator, even some of the Terminators that Arnold's played after this movie, tries to emulate. The way that he moves, the way that he walks, the kind of way he becomes smug and cocky, and like, I don't even know where that comes from in this. I know it's like a dramatic choice or whatever, but he's a robot. Like, you can go to the end of this movie when he gets shot up with a shotgun 8 times and then does this little like, why doesn't he just kill her? Like, he's got her right there, but instead he decides to be smug and cocky to bring Arnold back. So I think in a lot of ways, I mean, I get where you're saying, like, if you just look at him, like, even if you would put them now, like, next to each other, because he's kind of schlubby now, and Arnold still is schlubby by, like, Arnold standards, but better shape than I'll ever be. If you put them in a room and say they're going to fight, like, Arnold's going to beat the fuck out of them 9 times out of 9. But what he brings, the menace that he brings to that character, I think is something that changes this franchise for every iteration of the Terminator characters that come after this.
Yeah, I kind of get that. I know what you mean. It's just, I think it's more like, I think overall what he does with the character, I think is effective. It's just something about him just has never really worked that well for me. And I guess maybe part of it is the whole, you know, the story I've heard, or one of the fun facts, is that Billy Idol was supposed to play this. And I don't even know if that's true, but ever since I've
heard that,
yeah,
too.
ever since I've heard that, I can only see him as the T-1000 and do not want to accept anything but Billy Idol as the T-1000. It would have been a freaking blast.
So the story I heard with that is that Billy Idol was supposed to do it. He got in some motorcycle crash or something like that, and as a result, he was still getting, you know, repaired and couldn't be a liquid Terminator.
Yeah, I heard the same story. Yep.
Sean, how about you? What are your thoughts on some of these actors, characters, etc.?
I mean, I think they all just fit in together really well, and it's maybe from just seeing it so many times, it's hard to imagine anybody else playing these roles. And I think that when you brought up the kind of like when T-1000 gets shot up and he kind of shrugs it off and he's toying with her. It's like a cat, you know, the way that he portrays that role. It's like a cat with a mouse. He knows he can take her out at any time. He's just fucking around because he can. But like the funny thing, just not to focus too much on Robert Patrick, but, you know, doing research on the movie and trying to find silly stuff about it. Like I always had heard that, oh, Robert Patrick trained so well for, you know, all these running scenes that he does and how fast he is. And the strangest, just off the wall one that I found, it was on Facebook. Somebody posted on Facebook. It says, when Robert Patrick was cast for the T-1000, he trained with gold medalist Michael Johnson. He undertook a rigorous running regime and practiced breathing only through his nose. At the time of filming, this is what I laughed at. At the time of filming, he was able to reach top speed of 40 miles an hour, which is 13 miles an hour faster than the second fastest man alive, Usain Bolt. Really? Why didn't he just quit? He should have just went to the Olympics and like broke all the records.
Yeah, there's no way that's
40
he might have
miles
made
an
more
hour.
money doing this. He probably made more money from Terminator than he would have from the Olympics, but
40 miles an hour. Don't fuck with Robert Patrick. That's all I know.
I don't buy it.
He'll chase you. He's fast.
yeah, I don't buy it either. But I would have liked to see the scene where he chases him down and then he's really winded at the end of it. That would have been kind of funny. So
I did hear that there were a few times that they had to change the dolly speed or something because he was catching up to it when he wasn't supposed to, the camera, you know, the rig. But I mean, 40 miles an hour, come on.
for me, aside from, I'm not even going to spend too much time on Arnie right now because that's going to come up a lot in this. I think the two characters that almost get overshadowed by the two Terminators really are Linda Hamilton and Edward Furlong for two different reasons. With Edward Furlong, I can't think of another, because he's a kid he's what, 13, 14 in this movie, like his actual age, right around there. I can't think of a kid actor who he's still an annoying teenage prick. Like, I don't think I ever noticed that as a kid. I think as a kid, he was just like the kid that, you know, every little dirtbag on the block wanted to be because he had a Public Enemy shirt and like Guns N' Roses. Hey, I like Guns N' Roses.
He had that cool laptop that he could like hack PIN numbers and stuff with.
Yeah. He was like, you know, the ideal, like, you know, little Billy badass dirt biking around he was the original dirt biking dickhead, you know?
That's right.
So,
long lineage.
Right. He really is, as far as his performance and what he brings to this role, he carries a lot of weight in this movie. I mean, if you think about what the Terminator franchise is, this entire franchise really revolves around the character of John Connor, not the Terminators. So if he was the little shithead from Child's Play in this movie, it would ruin the entire franchise. But he pulls out so much and really gives a great performance in this movie. And even the points where he's being an annoying teenager, well, he's a teenager in the movie, so it kind of makes sense. Like, he should be this guy saying things like, chill out dickwad and stuff like that. Like it
No
fits
problemo.
for what yeah, exactly. It fits for this character, and it absolutely like oozes 90s like hard-edged dirtbag kid for sure. So, and then as far as Linda Hamilton and the character of Sarah Connor, what I love about this character is there's two things. I love the change we see from her from the first movie to the second movie. When we talked about the first movie, I had said, she's good in the first movie, but she's really kind of, I don't want to go as far to say she's a useless character because she's not, but she's woefully unprepared to be in the situation that she's in, and understandably so. And it shows in a lot of ways in the movie. They've kind of reinvented her. And I mean, with all due respect to characters like Ripley and so on with it, she is criminally underrated in the pantheon of like badass women protagonists. She should be right up there with all those characters. And you rarely hear Sarah Connor in this particular movie mentioned in one of those roles. She's one of the like most intense badass women that I can think of in film. And she also counters that by like the scene where she first encounters Arnold coming out of the elevator. I think is one of the best portrayals of just sheer terror put in film and done really well. Like I actually buy that this woman was traumatized by not necessarily this guy, but in her mind, this guy. And the idea of what she's running away from, he comes out the elevator and she doesn't even really scream. She just freezes and falls. And of course, then you get some great mayhem because he goes and starts like body slamming fuckers through windows and stuff. But she just brings so much to this role and she has so much depth to it. And it kind of takes a weird turn about halfway through where she starts being the narrator of the story for some reason. But it doesn't ever take me out of it. So I think they played her character really well. And they didn't just bring her back as like, here she is for another tag-along role. They gave her something to do and made her a really impactful character in this. And both these two, but her especially, holds her own against these two strong, fictional robot characters.
Well, she goes from being a character in the first movie that's just kind of there. Like she's the piece, the chess piece to be moved around and protected. And the second movie, she becomes like a force on her own. So where she doesn't necessarily need, well, they all kind of need each other. Like John, Sarah, and the 101 need each other, but she's less needy than she was in the first movie. Like you said, I mean, it would be like you going to your shift at the movie theater and all of a sudden some guy comes in and he shoots the place up and he's looking specifically for you and nobody can stop him. So it's understandable. She has PTSD when she first sees him and she can't even like you said, she can't even scream. She just like, it's like a yelp. It's like it's like when your throat closes up, like a gasp. Yeah, exactly. So and like you said, it's played like perfectly for the amount of terror that you would expect somebody to see.
And I would like
their worst nightmare coming back.
I would like to say that I'm glad you brought that up, John, because I think it's like a more natural reaction, because a lot of movies want to overdo that and have the protagonist scream or the victim scream, and a lot of times in real life it doesn't go that way. So, and I agree with both of you. Like, I think that this character is finally in this film more fleshed out and is a true, protagonist going up against, this big baddie that we have now in the T-1000, with the help, obviously, of, Arnie's Terminator as well. And then the Edward Furlong thing, I agree with you. Like, he's annoying as hell. And I've never really been a big fan of him as an actor, right? But for some reason, he really works here. And I think the fact that he's like going through puberty and he's like losing his voice at times also goes along with making it more realistic as a little teenage, bastard in a lot of ways, a real prick. So I think it really works, and it's a really fun performance overall for him in this movie. And I've thought that more on rewatches as an adult.
I think a lot of it with Furlong especially helps that we don't know, like when you saw this movie the first time, at least for anyone in this conversation, we probably didn't know what Edward Furlong was going to turn into. Mm-hmm. If he had just stayed on the trajectory of movies like this and American History X, he might still be annoying, but I think the masses would consider him a good to great actor if he stayed on that type of, path. That's not exactly what happened. So, he's gone on to be not that. I think I'd almost be curious if there's someone in the world that hasn't seen this movie and also doesn't know what Edward Furlong is now, like if they would have that same opinion.
Mhm.
But I have a feeling finding that person would be not necessarily easy to find.
Well, I want to break in and kind of break rank here, because we usually, we'll go through likes and dislikes or whatever. I have Edward Furlong as actually one of my dislikes. I feel like, tipping my hand here, I enjoy the movie, but spoiler alert, right, for later on in the show. But I think it's like, I don't know, there's so many, it feels like there could be, like, I don't know who could replace him, but there are so many actors of that age that probably could have filled it a little bit better. Like he comes across as awkward, which is good because this is his first thing. Like he's one of those stories of someone who was literally discovered at a mall or on the street or whatever. And they said, hey, you should try out for this thing. You ever act? And he's like, I don't even know what that is. So in that way, his awkwardness comes across really well, but at the same time, just, I don't know, like the delivery isn't natural. And I think that's what bothers me about it. Not so much that he's a shithead, because any kid in that role could just be a straight shithead, right? But I think it's just like the delivery of the lines and stuff could be, I don't know, it's something about it, and him as that character rubs me the wrong way, and I can't put my finger on what it is, but that's like one of my big dislikes in the movie, and it always has been. But obviously you can't just pick that one thing out and say, well, this movie sucks because this kid, this 10 to 13 year old kid, or however old he was. But I mean, he does portray this badass character, and as a kid myself seeing it, I hated him at the time. Like, man, this kid's such an asshole. Why does he get to have the cool? I have a big hang up on the laptop with the pin breaker thing, so that might come up again.
The pin breaker thing is so okay. So I'm
cool.
in the, well, sure, but I'm in the position where I actually work in a industry that deals with that. So the idea of what he's doing, I'm like, that's not how that works.
That's 1991. So, it's just a brute force.
It worked less in 1991 than it would have worked now, because there's no, okay, whatever. So I kind of skipped over the director of this film in James Cameron. So I'm going to hold off on him and go back to bring him back up near the end. Kind of feeding off the characters and actors. What are some of the scenes, Justin, we'll start with you. What are some of the scenes that really stick out to you as like real positives in this? And there's a lot to choose from in this movie. Mm-hmm. So you take as many as you want, as few as you want, wherever you want to go with it.
Yeah, so the early bar scene when Arnie arrives and kicks the shit out of a bunch of guys, that always works for me, okay? And the bar owner comes out with his shotgun and says he won't let him take the bike, and then Arnie comes up and disarms him with like little to no effort at all, and then steals the sunglasses to boot. And of course it's at night, and he's wearing sunglasses. I love that. So that whole scene always works for me. And any movie like this with that always works for me. Another thing that's always stuck out to me and I've always liked is the chase sequence in the storm drain, right? And it's an iconic backdrop in movies, especially during that time. And then the way that John's trying to get away on a dirt bike, and then you got the T-1000 driving a tractor trailer truck and then crashes that thing into the drain. It's just, it's amazing. It's just all action. The score during that whole sequence is really, really good. And then obviously there's a lot of stuff that happens after that I'm not as big of a fan. And I know we're not doing negatives now, so I won't get into too much of what I don't like about some of the stuff that happens after that. But we'll get to that. So, but I will say, like, the climax has always been one of my favorite in action. The final showdown, Arnie and his sacrifice, all that stuff always really works for me. So those are probably the ones, and I will say I kind of skipped over it, but the fun chase scene with the T-1000 like running after the vehicle, and he's getting blown into pieces, but he just keeps coming, and that's always fun for me as well.
I was going to say something, but I forgot what it was, so maybe I'll remember as Sean talks about some of the stuff that he likes.
Yeah, I mean, I got to say, I think a lot of the movie, the parts that really drew me in initially and did again watching it this time around, is like that opening, I don't know, like hour until they really get to the desert is like edge of your seat. Once the two Terminators come into the present, I was on the edge of my seat watching the whole time. Obviously I've seen it before, but like the whole mall sequence where T-1000's looking for John, in the arcade, and he's like, have you seen this boy? John Connor, have you seen this boy? And Nikki Cox is like a 12-year-old in this movie, which is funny. She's just like randomly appeared. I'm like, is that Nikki Cox? And I had to look it up. I'm like, sure as shit, it's Nikki Cox. But just the whole, like Justin said, with the chase scene in the reservoir and the whatever it's called, that whole sequence is really just suspenseful, even with like, you know, he's going to get away. You've seen it 100 times. You're like, but it's still, again, edge of your seat. He goes under that overpass and it takes the top of the truck off, and he just ducks under it. Arnie comes and rescues him. My favorite part of all those chase scenes, it's like a negative, but it's hilarious, is to look
You're
at all
the
the
stuntman, aren't you?
Yeah, all the times you look and see the stunt people. And now, of course, you have it on Blu-ray or you have it on real high res, and you can clearly make these people's faces out, and they're like, that's not Edward Furlong.
I feel like the
That's not
guy who
Arnie.
does I feel like the guy who does Arnie almost looks like he could also do Jean-Claude Van Damme.
Yes.
Like he's kind of right
Maybe it
between
was
their two
Jean-Claude Van
builds.
Damme.
I wouldn't have been shocked. Although Jean-Claude Van Damme was doing movies by this point, so probably not.
Hey, maybe
So.
you need some extra money, some pocket cash. But yeah, really up until the desert starts. That's where we start to get more of that character development, and then the scene in Skynet or Cyberdyne or whatever, when they find they have Miles and they go in and they get the original chip that they salvaged off the first Arnie that was sent back. I think that's a really cool scene. And even the Miles Dyson scene in his house when Sarah's like trying to pick him off, that whole scene, his son runs in. It's like, you stupid ass kid. What are you doing? These are real bullets, kid. Run off. But yeah, I mean, it's just, there's so many scenes in this movie that we talk a lot about movies that are like set piece to set piece to set piece, but this doesn't feel like that. It's more of a very cohesive thing. And all these places are just battlegrounds for James Cameron and the actors to have fun. And it really shows that they enjoy it. And I really like a lot of the scenes where I watched the special cut or the special edition or whatever, and there are just certain scenes. I'm not a big fan of the cut as a whole, but there are certain things that they do in that cut that I find really helpful to the story. Like when Kyle Reese, when they have a scene with Kyle Reese where Sarah Connor's like sleeping or whatever, she has this dream and she follows Kyle out of the psychiatric hospital. And then there's one, I can't remember if it's in the original, the theatrical cut or not, but when John is telling Arnold that he can't kill everybody or something, and there's a scene where they're driving in the car and he just kind of Arnold looks over at him and he's like, you just can't go around killing everybody. He just like shrugs his shoulders like, And I just cracked the hell up when I saw that. That was like, this is the embodiment of what I like about this movie. And I don't know if they do it more in the special cut or special edition or not, but there's just a lot of little humor bits that are sprinkled in there that I appreciate.
So you actually hit on two things that I really like that aren't necessarily scenes, but I think the one thing that I find myself liking more and more about this movie every time I go back to it as an adult is the humor in it. And it's a lot of things like, I love watching the scene where the two like jocks come and try to fight Edward Furlong for some reason. Not so much because of that. I love the way that Arnold puts the gun down when John tells him, put the gun down. Like he sets it down like it's a child. Like he's so gentle with it, which is kind of funny, but it's very robotic at the same time. You mentioned the desert scene. I absolutely love when he picks the little kid up by his like suspenders or whatever and just kind of looks at him as if he's looking at like a rotisserie chicken. Laugh at that every time. And then when you get like near the end, there's a lot of stuff that's sprinkled in there that's like really subtle, well-written humor. When they switch cars and go to the truck with the house or whatever on the back of it, and you know the T-1000's coming up in the nitrogen truck. I love when he chases the guy off the bridge because the guy makes this really hillbilly sounding, like trashy, like "Lah!" as he jumps over the bridge to not get hit by a truck. It's this like intense, like really ramped up scene, which, you know, culminates with everything else that happens, including him unloading like a full magazine from an AK-47 or something in his face. But they have this little goofy bit right in the middle that just lands perfectly. The other thing that's done so well in this movie, and I actually do think the theatrical cut does this better than the director's cut or the whatever we're calling it, is the pacing. It still works in the extended version, but this movie, and again, this is why I called it like a good way to jumpstart puberty, is this movie just moves from like action piece to action piece flawlessly while still taking just enough time to breathe and sprinkle in the amount of story that you need to keep it super interesting, keep you invested in it. And again, like you said, to your point, was this 30, 40 years later, whatever it is, keep you on the edge of your seat, just waiting for the next thing to happen, even when you know it's coming. So that's, to me, I think that's one. If anyone should teach a masterclass on pacing in an action film, it's James Cameron, just based off this movie alone. Probably others too, but mostly this. As far as like pull on scenes, I love when they go in to get Sarah. I think that is one of the best scenes, just because there's so much crazy. Like if you start that from when the T-1000 shows up at the psych ward or wherever she is, how that scene unfolds up to where she gets out of the room, she beats the shit out of the guy that licks her because creep's got to be a creep. She threatens to inject Drano in the doctor and then proceeds to have like the most terrifying like retreat, followed by like just mass amounts of chaos and effects that still rival what we get now 35 years later or whatever it is. I mean, it's just that scene for me is, it's lit really well. Everything looks good on it. It just plays almost flawlessly through that part. And again, I could almost say that every scene has something to really like in it. Like there's not a lot of scenes where sans the director's cut. There's not a lot of scenes where I'm like, you could get rid of that. Like the theatrical cut, it's one of the, I don't know if it's one of the few, but it's definitely one of the stronger cases that I think editing this down did it some favors as opposed to leaving everything in.
Well, I was going to add, I feel like the movie, you know, you can do so much with story and characters and all that stuff built into it, but how many movies have we all seen and talked about on our shows or whatever, where it's a great concept, but the execution was just kind of bad, and that's what kind of drug it down. This movie has a great story. It's got it's basically the beginning of a franchise, and we have the original Terminator, but this kind of veers off in a little bit of a different direction, and the performances are really well done. You can tell there's chemistry on screen. The story's really well done. The script was a good script. So a lot of times that happens, but the performances aren't there and the characters don't gel together. This one does. And just to go back to your point about the special effects, like you said, 34 years later, this is still like the high bar for a lot of movies. I mean, there are nitpicks, obviously, some of the, you know, I don't know, lighting on the models
specifically with
or
the
whatever.
T-1000 stuff.
Yeah, but a lot of stuff that they do with,
but
a lot of stuff they do with the T-1000 still holds up. So it's kind of, you know, little column A, a little column B. Some of it's not great. Some of it's still really good. And I feel like this is a movie that's always held up as like, this is what special effects were. How did we go wrong? You know, you have so many movies where somebody found, oh, my kid, he's going to college, or he got back from college and he left me his computer and we're going to start doing graphics on computers. And it looked horrible. But this movie still holds up. I mean, for the most part, we have a few scenes, even the scene with when the T-1000's calling John's foster home and the mom's talking and the guy's like, oh, he's drinking the milk carton essentially. And he gets stabbed with the blade on the end of her arm. And that still holds up. I mean, the way that they masked out some of the footage to do the special effects looks really well done. Mm-hmm. So I feel like that's always something that is brought up like in the same breath with like, oh, the movie's a great movie and the special effects still hold up.
Yeah. And
well, I think it almost plays to a movie. Go ahead, Justin.
Well, I was just going to say, you know, off of what you were just, you know, talking about, Sean, I really think that the look and even like the cool blue tones that this film has in much of it, I think it really, really looks good still. I think the shots, the cinematography, and to your point, the visual effects, you know, whether it's 91, 01, 2011, or even, you know, now, I think it still holds up really well, even against contemporary films. And another thing, back to when John was talking about some of the humor and some of the levity, I have always enjoyed the scenes where John is like, you know, trying to teach the machine how to be more human and, you know, trying to teach him slang and stuff. It really works for me, and it works, you know, just as well now as it ever did. So I didn't bring that up earlier because it's not really scenes, but it's definitely, you know, components of this story that I think really hold up well after all these years.
And how long did everybody hear Hasta la Vista? Like,
oh, geez.
You probably still hear it now, people saying it. It's like it's still held on, and it's because of this movie. And I forgot the baby at the end, but I mean, the whole thing is still, you still hear people say that. It's like bling.
Mhm.
No one will ever stop saying hasta la vista, baby.
Mhm.
or swag, or yeah. The other thing about the effects, that it's kind of like a movie. You could compare it to a movie like The Blob or The Thing or any of these like movies that are really heavy on special effects. You could tell that this is from a different era. Like, this movie wears, to an extent, it wears its warts on its sleeve. Like, the things that look like they're from 1991 stick out and look like they're from 1991. That said, they still look good. Like, there's nothing in this movie that looks objectionably bad, at least not that comes to mind. And if you take this and compare it to, like, you know, whatever Marvel movie you want to pick, doesn't really matter which, like, yeah, computers have come a long way in 30 years and you can do a lot of different things with it. That said, there's a lot of movies with, I won't go as far to say similar budgets, because this actually did have a pretty massive budget, but there's a lot of movies that have come out even in the last 2-3 years. I really enjoyed Late Night with the Devil. The scene at the end of that movie looks dramatically worse because of the effects than anything in this movie. And that's saying as someone who likes both films, but there's, even in good movies that we're getting in 2024, 2025, there are still CG effects that look far more half-assed or just flat out bad than what you see in this film.
I agree 100%. CG has its place, and it can be effective, and I get it's cheaper. It's a cheaper, more economical option, but practical effects are always, to me, going to hold up better than anything digitally done. So,
And I think a testament to this movie is that they really mix both really well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There are scenes, like you think of the liquid nitrogen scene when the T-1000 freezes. I mean, that's a practical effect of this thing shattering, and this, when he's walking and his leg breaks off. And when I watched it for the show, I was like, that's like insane that they did that, number one, and Patrick's performance of walking through that and all the crystallized, like the ice crystals on him and stuff, and he's walking through, and there are like little things that they do in the effects that show how ruthless this character is. Like, he's just, yeah, I'm frozen. Well, fuck it. I don't care. My mission is to kill these people, and I'm going to do it. And regardless of the damage, like most of the time, obviously he can recover from it. But this one is like, he just continues to press on, and it carries like the theme of the first movie where Reese is like, he will not stop until you are dead. It's the same thing. It's just a different form. And the future movies take on that same thing, right? Like, they get crazier with the designs of the Terminators and the Terminatrix and all that stuff. But Arnold set the stage in the first movie. I think Robert Patrick really bumps that up as T-1000 and pushing that forward. But you can't have something that stands so well, stands the test of time so well without mixing the digital with the practical. And I think that's what Cameron's always been he's had a real good eye for that. Whereas Marvel, like most of that stuff is CG and, yeah, obviously graphics and computers. And you look at a show like The Mandalorian and it's all, backgrounds are all done in Unreal and it looks great, and it's probably cheaper, to your point, but it's also like there's a time and a place for all of it. And just the mixing in this movie, I don't know, just really pushes it over for me.
So we've kind of skated around it. Justin, what's something that you didn't like about this movie? Or are there things that, because I could honestly say it doesn't sound like that's going to be the case here, but this would be a movie, as someone says, I really have no negatives on it. I'm not going to argue them as much as some other movies.
Yeah, so there's really not a lot. There's not. But I did say earlier, when I was talking about scenes, that I like this film a lot. I love this film. This film I have a special place with. It's part of my nostalgia for the early 90s, and I think it really holds up well. But the only negative nitpick I'll have about the film is during the second act, when you talked about the desert scenes, and I like it because it does develop some characters a bit and the relationships. But between the desert scene and, going to Joe Morton's place, like you said, and then the Skynet stuff, it drags a little bit for me, compared to the first and the first act and the final act. That's one thing that is a little bit of a nitpick, just minor, but there's that. And then the other thing, there's the two other very minor things. You had brought it up earlier. It's when you watch this film now in high def, you can clearly see there's like a dummy in the truck, for example. And the stunt doubles are a little more obvious in high def than they would have been in 91. So it's a little bit of a nitpick, but it doesn't take me out of it. And then the other thing I'll bring up is I really hate that sleazy bastard in the hospital with the thick glasses who licks her face. Like, fuck that guy, right? And then I already mentioned it earlier. I don't have problems with Robert Patrick. It doesn't take me out of it. To your guys' point, there's a lot of things he does well, and it definitely moves the trilogy or the franchise forward. So I'm good with that. But again, I really would have loved to have had Billy Idol. I can't get past thinking of him as the T-1000. So that, again, just a nitpick. But
doing the smear.
Yeah, oh my gosh, and he would have done it. It would have been iconic, and it would have given this film a little bit of camp that would have been fun for me. But really, honestly, guys, that's about it. Other than that, I think it's a great film. It holds up well, and I'll always go back to it.
I mean, can Billy Idol run 40 miles an hour?
I think he could.
Come on. He probably could. Was that, so like his Cyberpunk album that came out, was that around this time frame? That was like, I know it was early 90s.
It has to
I wonder if it kind of fits
in
into that
time frame.
Yeah.
I'm not a Billy Idol expert. I have no idea. So.
John, we came on this show because we thought you were going to give us all the facts about Billy Idol. What the fuck?
Wrong show. Sean, how about you? Is there anything you don't like about this movie or any dislikes? Or
I think I've aired it out already. Edward Furlong's the big kind of, and I agree with Justin, actually. The pacing with the desert, like that middle section, Act 2, is kind of drawn out, but I think the rest of the movie's so good, it kind of something I overlook.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think it's Edward Furlong's performance is a little, I mean, you know, he's a kid. Can't really shit on him for that. But the other thing, it's like a so bad it's good thing, is the stunt performers and being able to pick out all these guys. When the liquid nitrogen truck is bumping that little pickup and the dummies and only the driver is maybe wearing a mask. It might even be a dummy too. I can't tell, but the other ones are clearly just these mannequins that are pushed over to look like they're huddling up. I laughed, but it's like that looks kind of bad, but it's still, I think they're hilarious to like pick those things out and be like, yeah, that's not a dude. Like, but it's funny that, you know, that they're trying to pass it off as a dude. When this was released, you would have never seen that. You would have been like, oh, whatever. Or it's not like analyzed frame by frame, like somebody could take it home and read the newspaper articles or whatever that's in it now. So that's my only thing, and they're really minor.
For me, I think mine would be the biggest nitpick that I've ever brought up on this show. But the third act of this movie relies so much on plot armor coincidence that it's almost laughable. Okay, these guys came from the future and all this other shit happens and they just happen to pile onto this highway where a helicopter crashes, derails a truck that happens to be carrying liquid fucking nitrogen. They chase it, that happens to go to the only steel plant on the fucking planet that's open and active at like midnight, evacuates perfectly, doesn't somehow kill Sarah and John, who are the human characters, with all this gas that's like burning up in the air. Just, there's so much like that if you really think about it, it's like, what are the realistic odds that a helicopter crash and a liquid nitrogen truck would be within short proximity of each other ever under any circumstances? And it just kind of goes from there. So I feel like it works, and I never thought about it really until this time when I watched it, just how like insanely coincidental that entire sequence of events is.
It's like a Rube Goldberg machine, you know, all the things
exactly.
have to.
It's like a fever dream of just weird concepts just mashed together for this really great, you know, climax for the movie. But at the same time, when you watch it, if you're not thinking about it critically, you're not like, I almost watched it this time a little bit like, what can I say negative? Because, and again, spoilers, I really like this movie too. I almost went into it looking for something to kind of nitpick, and that was the biggest thing I could think of, is like, there's just so many little coincidental things, and you can kind of get into it a little bit if you want to talk about, like, you know, whatever the time travel rules are for this particular franchise. Because didn't they say in the first one, the only reason they were able to send the Terminator back was because they covered him with skin or something like that, or organs or whatever the suit, like the man suit they put him in? Okay, so if that's the case,
they covered him in organs,
whatever. If that's the case, how is the T-1000 supposed to travel through time? Because he's just like a gelatinous metal blob of goo. So they never really explain, and they don't need to. Like it works for the movie. You know, they also tell you like he can only imitate, you know, things of similar size and whatnot, but then he turns
not
into the
mechanical.
fucking floor.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, then he turns into the fucking floor for a little bit. So there's little continuity errors in this, I guess, that you could pick apart if you really wanted to. But when you're watching this movie just to enjoy a movie, none of that shit matters. It doesn't really take you out of it. It is something that, I mean, if you really want to break something like that down, go watch the CinemaSins on this, you know, movie, and they pick all that shit apart unnecessarily. But it's also one of those things that, again, I can't even strongly nitpick it because it's like, who cares? It's so much like, it's so entertaining when it happens. You're like, yeah, well, it is a movie. It's not supposed to be a real life representation of this, right? So
Exactly.
The one thing I always wondered is, you know, T-1000 is this guy. He's always the cop. I mean, he's not always the cop, but most of the time, right? We'll say 90% of the time he's on screen, he's the cop. Why?
Right.
Like, couldn't he turn into Sarah Connor and think like all the time? Or couldn't he turn into somebody else? Yeah, he's going to turn into you.
How come the LAPD never investigates the dead cop that he kills, the stolen police car that he's cruising around in, or any of the other things that are following this guy who has been in this form since he like landed on this timeline?
Yeah.
None of that ever happens. And again, who cares? I think the idea is this is also at a time where, depending who you are, like I think this public as a whole, not everyone, but as a whole, was more respecting of a cop in uniform at the time.
Mhm.
So I think the idea is they kept him as a cop because it just made it easier for him to get from point A to point B. Yeah, without, you know, question. I think now if they did it, especially in LA, he probably would have gotten shot, and they, you know, that could have been interesting. But to your point, yeah, I agree. Why is this the form that he sticks with? Why isn't he just constantly shape shifting into whatever? So Arnold can't pick him out, you know, or whoever. So that is a fair criticism too. And again, it's kind of like what I said. It doesn't really take you out of the movie, but if you really think about it, it's like, it's kind of weird.
And I think it would have been like a fun concept in the movie that even if he keeps that same, you know, skin, that same human form of Robert Patrick, obviously, but have him in different outfits throughout the film would have been just like a fun little thing to do as opposed to always being in the uniform. You know what I mean?
He could have been different village people.
Right.
He could have been
Even
like
big
the
Mr. Pringle
firefighter, the I don't know if there's a firefighter. Yeah, he could have been like the biker guy, or he could have been, I don't know.
French.
The other thing is like watching this as an adult, and when the nitrogen truck is driving up, and there's like a real small crew working in the steel mill, and they see this thing. I mean, I'm sure they don't know it's nitrogen, but like I was thinking, when this thing crashes,
aside from where it says nitrogen in giant bold letters on the side,
but
of
it's
the
coming
truck.
towards them. They can't see the side of it. But like these guys identify that something is coming towards them. Like, we got to get the hell out of here. If all that nitrogen actually would have hit all this molten steel, it probably would have just erupted, you know, molten steel all over everywhere. And it was like, oh, that's kind of a clever thought that they were just like, let's get the fuck out of here. I don't care what this is. We got to get the hell out of here. I just thought that was a nice touch that I would have never thought about when I was 14 or whenever I saw this initially.
I would think the prevailing thought is molten steel hot, truck flammable, run. So,
yeah,
to an extent. So
rain on my parade, John.
Yeah, that's what I'm
used to it.
So.
I know.
So before we wrap up on kind of some final thoughts with this movie is one I've never asked anyone this on a movie for this show before. And again, we're going to start with our guest, Justin. What do you think the legacy of this movie is? Because this is a movie that I think actually is worth having that conversation about.
Yeah, well, I agree. And, you know, I think even if you just take this film as a standalone, and I know that's hard to do to separate it from the rest of the franchise, but if you just look at it as an action film from the early 90s, I think it goes down as one of the greatest action films of its era. You know, whether it's the effects like we talked about, the longevity of the characters, the dialogue, just everything in this film, when I think of it, and you know me, I'm a 90s guy, it's just what I am, I'm a pop culture person, so I look at things per decade, and when I think about the action films of the 90s, and it's a great decade for action, I always come to Terminator 2. Always. It's always like in the top 5 for me all the time. So, you know, it's interesting to think of it this way because I've always treated this film as its own standalone thing. I love the first Terminator. Not the biggest fan of some of the later in the franchise, but I've always treated this film separately from everything else because I just think it has its own unique tone and it's of its time. And whether you talk about the Guns N' Roses aspect of it, you know, a young Edward Furlong, all of this stuff combined, just, you know, I think the legacy of this film is I think it will continue to stand out alone from the rest of the franchise as just this, you know, amazing action film. I don't even want to call it a popcorn film, but it almost qualifies as that from the early 90s and the type of fun entertainment that it provides. So that to me is what its legacy is, that it stands above all the rest in the franchise.
Sean?
Yeah, I mean, I got to agree 100%. This is obviously the high watermark for the series. I love 1. I think 1 is my favorite. But after 2, I never saw 3. That's the only one I haven't seen. And I've seen parts of it, but I haven't seen the full thing. And once you get to this movie, it's all kind of downhill from here. Genesis is kind of its own thing. The one with Christian Bale, which I can't, for whatever reason, can't remember the name of it. Salvation.
Actually kind of like that one for what it is, but that's a different conversation for a different episode. So,
and I feel like when Dark Fate came out, when I saw that, I was like, oh, this is kind of getting back to the roots, and I really like this movie, but there's no way that it could ever meet the level that of enthusiasm or whatever fandom or whatever that I have for this movie. So 1 and 2 really laid the groundwork for that, and it's like I'm a very big Terminator apologist, I think, for a lot of stuff. Like I'm like, oh, you know, Genesis not so bad. People hate Genesis. Salvation not so bad. Not as many haters, but I think people still are a bit haterish on that. And Dark Fate, I think, is actually really good. I might watch it tonight, actually, once we're done, because I want to think about, since I've seen this one now, it's like it's kind of fresh in my memory. But yeah, I mean, this is definitely the high watermark. This is, I don't want to give away too much of like my Jerry Springer closing thoughts on this movie. But this is like, to me, this is like the definitive sci-fi action film. And it's not even so much sci-fi other than some of the concepts of it. You know, it's not like an Aliens where that's like a straight up action sci-fi kind of movie. But this is definitely along those lines.
Yeah, I'd say this movie is a game changer for the action genre as a whole. I think movies after this aspire to hit this level of an action film. You think about movies like Con Air or movies like Bad Boys or whatever. Everything are these huge action set pieces, and in a lot of ways they feel like they're just kind of knocking off the things that Terminator 2 did really well. Some of them better than others, and that's, again, different conversation for a different episode. But I think this movie my opinions about this one in particular and where it is in the franchise we'll get to in a minute, but this movie, I think, kind of reestablished what an action movie was. It kind of took it out of being these kind of kitschy, like almost B movies. Like you don't see movies like Cobra after this, or at least not as much. You don't see movies like even Commando, some of Arnold's earlier stuff after this so much. These little like one dimensional, like the big guy goes and kills all the bad guys and some stuff blows up and that's it. This took it to a whole different level. I think that's the biggest thing about this is, you know, we've kind of hit on it, marrying the practical effects and the computer effects in a way that's entertaining, making it look good, and then really making, I mean, I know there were summer blockbusters before this movie, but this movie had to redefine how people thought about what a summer blockbuster was. And I feel like in a lot of ways, Terminator franchise aside, it's still one of the high watermarks for what a summer blockbuster movie can be. So I think that's really what its legacy is. And, you know, if I really wanted to think about it, I might be able to find one that I could say is better at that, but it'd be hard to do. Like I'd almost have to sit down with like pen and paper and like disprove myself over and over again to do it.
Justin, I feel like we got set up. I think John had this question in mind. He had this big, we didn't come up with stuff like high bar for like action movies in general, man. Geez, you really put a lot of thought into this.
Actually, I didn't. So I put thought into what I was going to say at the end, but let's go to that. So we're going to start wrapping up here. Lead us off, Justin. The floor is yours.
What time is it?
Oh, yeah. It is. What time is it?
Then you're in for a big treat, bro. Because it's hot dog time.
Fucking up our own shit. So you don't have to put any numbers on it. If you whatever you want to do, the floor is yours. What are your kind of closing thoughts on Terminator 2?
Yeah, so, nitpicks aside, I've said all the things that I really enjoy about this movie. It's easily one of my favorite films of the 90s. It's a big part of my growing up as a film goer, a film lover, and a pop culture lover, because I think it also, and I didn't really say that earlier, but I think it's important to pop culture as a whole outside of just film. As far as hot dogs, if I was to give it as a scale of 10, it would be tough for me to give this the full 10 to say it's a perfect film, because I did have some issues with the middle part, the middle section of the film. I think could have been a little tighter. But I would probably say easily 9.5 out of 10. I'm that high on it because of everything I said about it and where it exists for me as a fan of the series, of the characters, of the story, of the look of the film. And I said earlier, I think it's always going to stand up as an important part of pop culture, an important part of action film, the action film genre in filmmaking in general. And even though I'm not the biggest James Cameron fan, I think this movie showcases what he can do as a big budget blockbuster filmmaker. And, between this and Aliens, I think he's one of the best to do that. And having said all that, again, I could keep going, but I love this film. In spite of any of the flaws that I think it has, I think it's a great, entertainment that anybody at any age can have fun with. It's funny to call this like almost good for the whole family, but I think it is. Because even at 10, I enjoyed the hell out of it. So I think there's a lot there for kids. There's enough intelligence there for adults. So, fun for the whole family. I love it. That's my take.
You heard it here first.
Family film.
Kids movie. Pixar, watch out. We got T2.
Sean, I'm going to jump in front of you since you're the resident.
Whose hot dog is this? That yours?
It's my hot dog. I'm going to jump in front of you because you're the Terminator apologist, as you put it so perfectly. To me, when you think about movies from this decade, this is like easily, like you can make an argument for this as being the best movie of the entire generation. And I'd put it up there with, I love Goodfellas, Jurassic Park, Scream, probably a handful of others. Like it's in that echelon of these like great iconic films that just haven't been topped. It's got this weird place in the Terminator franchise because it's kind of like what he did with Aliens. It's kind of like movies like after Halloween 2. Like it's one of those movies that after this movie in the franchise, it just feels like a whole different, it's the same franchise, but it feels like they're just on something different. It's like when you get into the Thorn trilogy and Halloween, it's like, yeah, these are still Halloween movies, but they're not really the same fucking thing as what we had with Halloween, and we not even talking about Halloween 2 at the moment. So it's kind of got that nice factor of like, if you pair this with just 1 and 2, you have a perfect franchise right there, or as close to perfect as you're going to get right there. Everything else after that is just, milking the golden goose, for lack of better wording. Every character in this is well written. Everyone gives their all as far as an acting performance goes. I mean, we're not doing the whole like number scale on it, but I throw every hot dog and throw at this. Like, this is a movie that I don't think there will ever be a time in my life where if someone says, you want to watch Terminator 2, I'm gonna be like, no, I don't really feel like watching that. Like, this is like a real twist my arm movie to watch. And behind the scenes, you'll hear these a little out of sequence. We're just coming off our sweaty January episodes. And I said to Sean, I think like a week ago, I'm like, I really need a fucking palate cleanser. Can we talk about Terminator 2 or something? Because I need something to break us off of these like sweaty, horny aerobics movies for the next 4 weeks. So
11 months.
Yeah. So yeah, that's my thoughts on it. Is it perfect? No, but it's about as close as you're going to get. And again, anything that I'm going to say negative about it is the most nitpicky of nitpicks I can think of.
Whose hot dog is this? That yours?
I guess that leaves me with a final word, like Jerry Springer. I mean, I've already said it. This is the definitive sci-fi movie of all time. sci-fi action movie, of all time for me, full stop. Like, there's no... Aliens probably comes pretty close, but that's mixing genres to the point where they're different, they're just different. I mean, it's no secret I love the original Terminator. That's my favorite of the series. But these are on two totally different levels. Terminator 2 expands on the original, pushes the special effects. It keeps Arnold as the badass. It adds these new wrinkles where the Terminators are now on opposite sides of each other. One's defending, one's the attacker. And now we have a fully capable Sarah Connor, and we have that added wrinkle of John Connor being in this, the young John Connor. And he has to kind of figure out his place. He has to take the lead on some things, and it kind of adds complexity to the character that we start to see more in the later movies, but we're not talking about those. Again, this is the definition of a thrill ride kind of movie to me, and I'm just going to leave it at this. This gets a whole hot dog for me, like the full thing. If you haven't seen it in a while, you need to watch it. If you haven't seen it ever, what are you doing? You got to just stop this podcast, and go watch this movie and revel in its, everything.
After we spoiled everything for you. So
Right. Well, we didn't say everything, but
that's what we got for this week. So we're going to start wrapping up here. Again, Justin, the floor is yours. Outside of talking shit about No Holds Barred, please tell everyone where they can find you, where they can find your show. Anything you want to plug, go for it now.
All right, yeah, thank you. Yeah, hey, listen, No Holds Barred is a part of my history as a pop culture nut as well. I was the WWF fan since I was small enough that I don't even remember. So trust me, No Holds Barred is to me a piece of shit, but it's fun. I give you that. It's plenty of entertainment.
It's a piece of dookie.
It is a piece of dookie for sure. But thank you guys for having me on. I've said it before. John, when you were on my show, I really enjoy what you guys do. I listen every week, and it was about time. It was long overdue for me to come on here and chat about a movie. And I'm glad you picked this one because hopefully it came across that I really love it, because I feel like I nitpick quite a bit, but it's just because I was trying to be more critical. But this movie's great. It's fun. So thank you for having me on. It was a lot of fun talking about it. As far as my show, I do want to say that this year, 2024 was a big year for me personally with this whole journey. And having, guests on after doing it solo was a big deal. And, I figured might as well go at it in 2025. So I have a lot of new people coming on, and I'm really excited about it. So it's going to be really music heavy, but there's a lot of movies that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to incorporate some more television, a lot of pro wrestling stuff yet to come. So if anyone likes the show, it's going to be a lot more of the same, but dialed up to 11, I think, in 2025. So it's going to be a lot of fun. But yeah, like I said earlier, you can find the show on any of the major podcast platforms. And you can find me on Instagram, on Threads at Pop Culture Reflections Pod. And also, I just joined Blue Sky as well, so you can find me there. And I'm on Facebook. I don't really go on there much, but you can find the show on there as well. Also, if you look up Pop Culture Reflections Pod, you will find it on all those places. And of course, the You Run Podcast Network at yourunpodcast.com.
Everywhere that Justin is available, we will link it in the show notes for this episode, so you can just click away and get to that. Pop Culture Reflections has become one of my shows that I listen to pretty much the day that it comes out. I really appreciate Justin's takes on things. He does not bring just the same old take that everyone has. He actually brings an opinion, which makes his show really unique. So please do yourself a favor, check it out, go back and listen to the episodes that interest you. I know he'll tell you not to listen to the early ones, but do what you want to do. And again, thank you for coming on. We will we'll get you back. We've been threatening doing Wrestler Mania a whole month on wrestler movies for the entire existence of this podcast. So that might happen one of these days. For us, you can, of course, find us on any social media outlet that we care about. We're at Dewey Pod Monster. Just search us. You can find us on there. We are on the You Run Podcast Network as well, yourunpodcast.com. Please go there. And if you listen to our show, if you listen to Justin's show, please find a show that you haven't listened to yet and give them a try. There's a lot of good stuff on there and worth checking out. And I'm probably forgetting something. Sean, what did I drop the ball on? Oh,
no, you covered it.
Rockin' Tomatoes. I forgot about that.
Oh, I'll cover Rockin' Tomatoes. So, yeah, I mean, if you want to interact with the show, You can find us on all the social medias at Dewey Pod Monster. If you want to check us out on our website, you can check us out at crap.town, of course, or rockintomatoes.com. Rockin' Tomatoes will take you to crap.town. You'll be able to see all the cool stuff that we're doing over there, which, I don't know. I don't know where to go from there. It's so cool, you won't believe it. And if you want to find out any of my Michigan craft beer adventures, you can check me out at youtube.drafttherapy.com or check me out on social media at Draft Therapy.
All right, so that is it for this week. We'll be back in the near future. I'm not going to tell you what we're covering next. You'll just have to stay tuned and find out. Until then, have a great week. Cheers.
Blah, 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 blah.